At the theater, they gave me a ticket for the last row. The usher didn't look me in the eye, just gestured vaguely toward the far corner like he was afraid I might ask for something complicated, like dignity. The chair creaked beneath me, and when I turned to ask if I might sit with my family, they'd invited me after all, or so I thought. The usher glanced at the ticket again and said, "No, ma'am, this is your seat." As though the seat and I were old friends, as though there were a logic to putting a woman who once spent her youth on that very stage as far from it as humanly possible. That was my place, apparently. The last row, the shadows. I sat down, holding my coat in my lap like a child who hadn't yet learned where to put her hands. From that far back, the stage looked like a diorama, a flattened little box of light and effort. And still, somehow, the spotlight found me. It swept the crowd, catching dust motes and good intentions, then landed right on my face for a full 2 seconds before it moved on. A mistake, surely. But someone behind me whispered, "Oh, she's someone," like they could sense something was off. Something had cracked open. I am 81 years old. I live alone now, in a second-floor apartment above a nail salon, and across from a bakery that opens too early and plays the radio too loud. My name is Clara, and once, a long time ago, I had another name too. Not different, just larger. Clara Fontaine, the woman in the playbills. It's been decades since I wore stage makeup, since the smell of hairspray and sawdust clung to my coat, since I felt the tremble in my ribcage that came not from fear, but from the anticipation of breathing life into someone else's words. I was never famous, no, but I was good. I was very good. People clapped because they meant it. Directors called me back. There were moments, God, there were moments, when I felt like I was more than a person. I was an echo people wanted to hear again. But life, as it tends to do, stepped in with its heavy, clumsy boots. There was a marriage, and then there wasn't. There was a daughter, then a grandson. There were bills and bruises and basements, full of things I meant to throw away. My scripts grew dusty. The phone stopped ringing for auditions, and I stopped offering. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like someone turning down a dial until the silence becomes normal. I found work in libraries, then a school, then nowhere at all. I made birthday cakes. I sewed hymns. I gave advice no one asked for. And somehow, I convinced myself that I'd done the right thing, the normal thing, the noble thing. I'd stepped away. I'd given room. But really I'd been ushered out, the same way I was ushered into that back row. It was my granddaughter Eloise who invited me to the show. She's 22, studying journalism, full of opinions and energy, and a kind of brittle compassion that makes you feel like a problem that must be gently managed. "It's just community theater," she said, "but it'll be fun. You'll love it." She bought the tickets, arranged everything. "We'll all go," she said. Her boyfriend, my daughter Lena, and me. I dressed carefully that evening, not extravagantly, but with purpose. Navy coat with a velvet collar, blouse with a small pearl at the throat, the kind of shoes that reminded me of the ones I wore during curtain calls. I even touched up my lipstick, though the tube was so old it felt more like nostalgia than cosmetics. I arrived a little early, out of habit. The lobby buzzed with the kind of low-stakes excitement only small theaters know. Laughter that tries not to echo, hugs from people who haven't seen each other in 2 years, programs folded tightly in palms. I waited near the stairs, scanning for my family. When they finally came in, flushed from the cold, talking too loudly, Eloise waved at me with one hand and texted with the other. "Hi, Grandma," she said, barely kissing my cheek. "We've got our seats." Yours is... Hang on. She rummaged in her bag and pulled out a crumpled ticket. You're in E17, she said, not looking up. I think it's in the back. I blinked. We're in B. It was just easier with the way I bought them online. But you'll see fine, it's a small venue. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a shrug. Just easier. That phrase hit me harder than it should have. Easier. That's what I've become. A variable to manage, an equation to simplify. I opened my mouth to say something, but Lena was already moving toward the usher with their tickets, calling over her shoulder, "We'll see you after, okay?" And so I made my way down the narrow aisle alone, counting the rows. The backs of heads in front of me swayed and tilted. Someone sneezed, someone else whispered too loudly. I sat in E17 and folded my hands over my coat, fingers pressed to the place where the button had fallen off years ago, but I never bothered to replace. The curtain rose. I tried to watch. I really did. The play was well-meant, clumsy, a modern adaptation of something older. The actors were too loud, then too soft. The blocking was awkward, but I saw it, the effort, the reach, and I envied it more than I can say, not because it was good, but because it was theirs. At intermission, I didn't move. No one looked my way. My family didn't come back to check on me, didn't wave. I saw them in their seats, clustered together, laughing at something. For a moment, I wanted to cry. But not because of the play, not because of the seat. I wanted to cry because I realized, sitting there in that awful plastic chair, that I had been performing invisibility for so long, I forgot it wasn't the role I was born to play. And then the spotlight came. Not for long, just a sweep across the crowd, meant to simulate moonlight or a street lamp or some other imagined source. But in that half second, it hit me, square on. And I knew what to do. I turned my face into it. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I let it sit on me like a hand that remembered. And somewhere in the dusty scaffolding of that theater, I heard it. Applause. Not real, not yet. But memory has its own sound, and I heard it. The moment I knew it wasn't a mistake came not in the theater, not in the long silence that followed the show, but in the parking lot, under the yellowish hum of a broken lamppost. The cold had settled in by then, thin and sharp, the kind that gets into your bones before you realize it. I walked slowly toward the car, careful on the uneven pavement, still holding my coat over one arm like a shield. My family stood ahead, clustered near Lena's car, laughing about something I hadn't heard. I was maybe 15 steps behind them, close enough to call out, but I didn't. I wanted to see if anyone would turn. No one did, not even Eloise, who had insisted I come, who had said, "We want you there." I watched her get into the front seat, pull the door shut without looking back. Lena opened the trunk and put in her purse. She looked up, saw me approaching, and said nothing, just waited until I caught up, then turned the key and started the engine. I slid into the back seat and closed the door. "Good show," I said, not because it was true, but because I wanted to be the kind of person who said things like that. The car filled with the sound of the heater and Eloise scrolling on her phone. Lena adjusted the mirrors. "It was okay," she said. "Some of the acting was a bit much." Then she added, as if it were a joke, "But I guess that's theater, right, Mom?" I didn't answer. I stared out the window, watching the other cars inch their way out of the lot, all their taillights blinking in synchrony, like something mechanical pretending to be human. No one asked me what I thought. No one asked how I felt, sitting 5 rows behind them while they laughed and whispered and shared a bag of butterscotch drops, the way they always used to when Eloise was small. And I sat alone in the last row, watching a version of life I used to know, mirrored poorly on stage. Back at the house, Lena went straight to the kitchen. The clink of glasses, the sound of the fridge opening, a cork squeaking out of a bottle. Eloise disappeared into the guest room, where she'd been staying since her internship began. I stood in the hallway for a moment, coat still over my arm, unsure if I was meant to follow, to join, to sit. No one said, no one invited, so I hung my coat and walked into the living room, easing myself into the armchair by the window. It was too modern, too deep, the kind you sink into in a way that makes getting up a small battle. On the wall were photographs. Eloise at graduation, Lena on a beach, a blurry picture of some concert stage, but none of me, not one. Not even from the years when I was the one behind the camera, making sure their smiles were right. I looked for my reflection in the dark glass of the window. All I saw was the lamp behind me, glowing like a distant moon. Lena brought me tea eventually, setting it down on the side table like a nurse delivering pills. "Here you go," she said, already turning to leave. "Thanks," I murmured. "It was kind of you to get me a ticket." She paused. "Of course. I mean, it's not easy to get 4 seats together last minute." That was it. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. I wasn't placed in the back because the system glitched. I was placed there because it made things easier, because I had become the kind of presence that needed to be gently managed, strategically positioned, distanced just enough to be polite, but not intrusive. I was a burden, lovingly arranged out of the frame. Lena smiled faintly and disappeared down the hallway. I sat there long after the tea had cooled, staring at the slice of ceiling between the curtains and the wall, the place where the shadows gathered. A memory surfaced, uninvited. I was 28, standing in a tiny green room with cracked mirrors, running lines with a girl named Marion. I was playing Blanche, and Marion was Stella. We were both nervous, both brilliant, both waiting for life to either choose us or pass us by. I remember the moment before the curtain went up, my heart beating fast but clean, my palms dry for once, the sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. That version of me felt so far away, it was like remembering someone else's life. And yet, that woman, that younger Clara, would have recognized this feeling tonight for what it was. Exile. Later that night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I'd gone to get a glass of water, and their voices were just there. I froze by the stairwell, listening. Eloise said, "She was weirdly quiet tonight." Lena responded, "She always is when she thinks she's being sidelined. It's like, Mom, not everything is about you." They laughed softly. Then Eloise added, "I think she still believes she was some big deal, like she was in a few plays 40 years ago, and suddenly she's Judi Dench." Another laugh, Lena's voice. "I know. We love her, but she can be a bit much. That's why I put her back a few rows. She tends to perform." That last word hung in the air like a door slammed in my face. I returned to the guest room without the water. I lay on the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, as though even it was bored. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. The words had been so casually spoken, so easily exchanged like facts or weather. I realized then that this wasn't about theater. Not really. This wasn't about one night or one seat. This was about years of being quietly rewritten in their minds, reduced to a quirky elder, a slightly inconvenient relic, a source of stories no one quite believed. They had built a version of me that was easier to carry, simpler, gentler, smaller, A woman who smiled politely, who stayed out of the way, who asked for little and gave just enough to seem grateful. A woman who didn't mind being erased, so long as she could sit nearby and hear the laughter. But I did mind. And I had, for a long time. I just hadn't said it out loud. I had swallowed too many of these little cuts, harmless on their own, but together forming a slow, steady erosion. The invitation to family events that came after the planning, the photos taken without me, then shared without shame, the jokes about my acting days, said with fondness, but never respect. Even the way Eloise looked at me now, like someone studying an artifact in a museum. Curious, but not reverent. I thought of the spotlight that had found me, however briefly. It wasn't a miracle, it was just light. But it was enough to remind me that once people looked at me because I demanded it, because I stood in front of them and became someone they couldn't ignore. And suddenly, I wanted that again. Not the stage, not the costumes, not the applause, just the clarity, the certainty, the right to be seen. The next morning, I packed my bag early. Lena came downstairs with her phone in hand and stopped short when she saw me. "Oh," she said, "you heading out?" I smiled faintly. "I think I've overstayed." She blinked. No, don't be silly. You can stay." But her voice was too quick, too practiced. "I've got things to do," I said, "and you've got your life to get back to." She hesitated, then nodded. "Well, safe travels, okay? Let us know when you get home." I left before Eloise woke up. The train station was nearly empty. I sat by the window, my coat folded neatly on my lap, the same way it had been the night before. As the train pulled away, I watched the city fade behind me, its edges blurring into something forgettable. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this. I would no longer sit in the back, waiting to be remembered. After I returned from Lena's house, something shifted in the air around me, though nothing visible changed. The apartment looked the same. The little ivy plant, still struggling for light on the sill, the faint stain on the ceiling from last winter's leak, the old radio on the counter that only played one station. But I felt as if I had stepped into my life as an uninvited guest. Everything I touched seemed unfamiliar. I unpacked slowly, not because I was tired, but because each item I lifted from the suitcase felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. The navy blouse I had worn to the play, the one I had once called my lucky blouse, looked pitiful in the closet now, sagging on its hanger like a collapsed tent. I left the suitcase half open for days, stepping around it like a crime scene. I told myself I was just easing back in, that I'd wash everything tomorrow, fold it neatly, sort the mail, restock the fridge. But tomorrow came and went, and still the suitcase remained, half empty, half full, like I couldn't quite commit to staying. I stopped calling. I used to call Lena once a week, just a quick check-in, just enough to stay visible, to remind them I still existed somewhere outside their schedules. I'd ask how work was, how Eloise was doing, and they'd always answer, distracted, mid-task, voices fading in and out as they cooked or drove or scrolled. I thought it mattered that I called, that maybe it helped them remember me. But after the theater, after the quiet cruelty of being deliberately excluded and then laughed about in my own daughter's kitchen, I found I had no questions left, no small talk, no cheerful tones. I let the week pass, then another. No one called me first. No one asked where I'd gone, if I was well. I might as well have been in the theater still, in that last row, invisible and neatly filed away. The small interactions that had once made up the rhythm of my days also began to erode. The clerk at the pharmacy, stopped asking how my arthritis was. The neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Patel, with whom I'd once exchanged soup recipes and gossip about the building's plumbing, stopped pausing at my door. One morning, I opened it to find she'd left her extra paper as always, but with no note, no knock, just a folded square of silence. I read it at the table, sipping lukewarm tea, the words on the page blurring into a fog of ink. It was as if the world sensed my unraveling and politely turned its head. Even my own body seemed to retreat. My joints ached more than usual, my appetite thinned to barely there nibbles, and my voice, once my greatest tool, grew quieter, hesitant. When I spoke to myself in the mirror, which I did more often now, reciting half-remembered lines from old roles, the sound echoed strangely, like it came from another room. I didn't recognize it. I'd say, "I am not afraid," from Medea, or "I have a name," from The Crucible, and the mirror would look back with blank politeness, unconvinced. The worst part was not the loneliness. I'd known loneliness. It had followed me like a shadow after the divorce, had crept in beside me in the bed for years afterward. I could manage loneliness. No, the worst part was the sensation of being gently erased, not with cruelty, not with violence, but with the soft cloth of convenience. I was being dusted away. Each day that passed without a call, without a visit, without a question, was another brushstroke painting me out of the frame. I had spent decades caring for people, cooking, teaching, mothering, smiling when I was tired, showing up when no one else did. And now that I needed something, not money, not help, just recognition, I was being quietly shelved. One Thursday afternoon, I received a message from the community center, just a generic newsletter with upcoming events and a call for volunteers. Normally, I'd delete it, but this time I opened it and read every word. A line near the bottom caught my eye: Oral History Project, seeking participants willing to share memories of city arts and culture, 1960s to 1980s. I stared at the sentence for a long time. It was vague, probably some underfunded local archive project. Still, something in me stirred. I copied the email address into my notebook, then closed the laptop. I didn't write to them, not yet. I just wanted to see if the impulse to be heard would survive the night. It did. The next morning, I drafted a message. I kept it short. My name is Clara Fontaine. I was active in the city theater scene during the 1960s and 70s. I'd be interested in speaking with someone about that time. I hovered over the send button. It felt almost laughable, as if I were pretending to matter again. But then I thought about the spotlight in the theater, the way it had found me, accidentally or not, and I pressed send. I didn't expect a reply, so when one came, the very next day, I read it 3 times to be sure it was real. A young woman named Maribel wrote, "We'd be honored to speak with you. Would you be open to an interview next week? We can come to you or arrange a call, whatever's most comfortable." I stared at the screen, heart thudding. It wasn't a role. It wasn't a stage. But it was something, a space, an invitation, a line back to the version of me I thought I'd buried under years of silence. I said yes, and then I panicked. What would I say? Who was I now to speak with authority? I hadn't acted in decades. My name hadn't been in a program since Reagan was in office. I didn't even own a single photo from my performing days, only memories, faded and shifting. I spent the next few days tearing through drawers, hoping to find a relic, a prop, some proof. I found one, an old review, yellowed and curled at the edges, from a tiny arts paper that folded in the 80s. It described me as raw and luminous, unafraid of silence, commanding even in stillness. I pressed the clipping between the pages of a cookbook and placed it on the table like an offering. When Maribel arrived, she was warm, nervous, over-apologizing. She set up a small recorder on the table, opened a notepad, and said, "Whenever you're ready." I was not ready. I hadn't spoken like that in years. But I began, slowly at first, tentatively. I started with a company that rehearsed in an old church basement. The walls were damp. You could hear the pipes gurgle through Shakespeare. Maribel laughed. I kept going. We did Brecht and O'Neill and Ibsen with no budget and bad lighting and an audience of 6. But God, we were alive. We believed in story like it could change people's bones. The words came easier after that, I remembered. Not everything, not names or dates, but the feeling, the pulse of it. I told her about the time our lead actor got food poisoning, and I stepped in, off book, in a borrowed suit. About the time the fire alarm went off mid-scene, and the audience thought it was part of the show. About the dressing room mirror that cracked down the middle during my first soliloquy and stayed cracked for the rest of the run. I told her how I used to stand in the wings and whisper, "Be bold, be better, be seen," before every curtain rise. When we finished, Maribel said, "Would you mind if I recorded a short clip of you reading something, just to include in the archive?" I nodded. I didn't ask what. She handed me a printed monologue. It was unfamiliar, modern. I read it anyway. My voice stumbled at first, catching in my throat, dry and out of practice. But by the third line, something clicked. My diaphragm remembered. My breath dropped. My vowels rounded. My spine lengthened. I read the piece to the end. And when I looked up, Maribel was crying. That night, I sat in the dark with a cup of tea, staring at nothing, not in sadness, not even in nostalgia, but in awe, because I had felt it again, the certainty, the presence. The part of me that had been quietly fading, like a name on a headstone in the rain, had stood up. She was still here, not young, not flawless, but whole. And that was when the fear started. Because once you remember you're alive, the silence around you begins to feel violent. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I had in years, not out of vanity, but with a sort of quiet reverence, as if I were waiting to see whether the woman from yesterday's interview had truly returned or whether she'd vanished, with the applause I imagined echoing inside my head. The light from the window was unkind, casting every crease and soft fold of skin into sharp relief, but I didn't look away. I tilted my chin slightly, parted my lips, and recited the first lines I ever memorized. Chekhov, I think, or maybe Shaw. Something about not asking the world for forgiveness just because you kept breathing. My voice was hoarse but present, rusty but recognizable. There was a tremble at the edge of it, not from fear or frailty, but from the awe of recognition, the way you might feel if you opened a drawer after 40 years and found the exact necklace you thought had been stolen. It was still mine, my voice, my rhythm, my weight in the room, and suddenly I couldn't remember why I had allowed so many years to pass in silence, why I had accepted being spoken over, being smiled at and ignored in the same breath, being mentioned only in holiday cards and text message chains. It wasn't rage that rose in me. It was clarity, sharp and undeniable, like finally hearing a bell you didn't know had been ringing all along. Later that afternoon, I returned to the theater, not the grand old stage where I'd once performed, that one had been gutted long ago and turned into luxury condos, but a small black box venue tucked between a barbershop and a closed bakery. I'd passed it a dozen times without thinking, assuming it was defunct or empty, But that day, the door was propped open with a sandbag, and a handwritten sign taped to the glass read, "Open Mic Rehearsal. Actors Welcome." I walked past it, then doubled back, pretending to check my phone, my heart beating faster than it had in weeks. I stood outside for a moment, listening to the muffled thrum of voices inside, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of a folding chair scraping across linoleum. I had no intention of going in. I hadn't prepared anything. I didn't even know what they were doing in there. But my feet betrayed me. They stepped inside, slow but certain, like they remembered a rhythm I'd forgotten. The inside smelled like old paint and coffee grounds. A group of people, some young, some middle-aged, one man about my age with a long gray braid, were seated in a half circle facing a small platform stage. A woman with a clipboard glanced up, smiled, and said, "Come on in. We're just getting started." I nodded, the way one nods when they don't know what they're agreeing to, and took a seat near the back. No one asked my name. No one asked if I belonged. They just kept going, taking turns reading short scenes, monologues, audition pieces, offering kind and quick feedback, nothing fancy, just a room full of people who missed the feeling of pretending to be someone else for a while. When they paused for a break, I rose quietly and asked if it was all right to read something. The woman with the clipboard blinked, surprised but not unkind. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward the platform. I climbed the 2 short steps up and stood center. The lights weren't on, just fluorescent ceiling panels buzzing faintly overhead. I didn't have anything printed, no prepared piece, so I closed my eyes and pulled from memory. Not something famous, not even something particularly good, just something mine. A monologue I'd written once in the margin of a notebook during a tech rehearsal in 1976. I didn't even know I still remembered it until I heard the first line come out of my mouth. "You can only vanish if someone's still looking for you." I kept going, not thinking, not planning, just letting the words come, shaped by years of silence and the ache of finally being heard. The room was quiet when I finished, not dramatically so, just a thoughtful hush, the kind that happens when people aren't sure if clapping would break something fragile. Then the man with the braid said softly, "That was real," and someone else whispered, "Thank you." I didn't cry. I stepped down, returned to my chair, drank a cup of lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, and listened as someone read a scene from Death of a Salesman, like it was being said for the first time. Afterward, people came over to shake my hand. No one asked where I'd trained or what I'd done. No one asked for credentials. They just said, "Will you come back next week?" And I said yes, because something inside me had cracked open, not in pain, but in possibility. That night, I walked home slower than usual, not because of my hips, but because I didn't want the night to end too quickly. The city was cooling down, a thin breeze threading through the trees, streetlights blinking on, one by one, like quiet invitations. I passed the old theater, my old theater, and stood for a moment on the opposite sidewalk, looking at the windows on the second floor where the green room had once been. There was nothing left of the place I knew. No posters, no chipped paint, no scent of sweat and foundation, but I still remembered the way the wood floor creaked right before your entrance, the way the curtains smelled like dust and hope. I closed my eyes and saw it again, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know I had once been part of something that mattered, that was alive, that left a mark, even if no one else remembered. When I got home, I went to the closet and pulled down the box I hadn't opened in over 20 years. Inside were playbills, postcards, an old scarf I used in 3 different productions, and a pair of shoes I wore until the soles thinned to whispers. I laid them out on the floor like relics, not to weep over them, but to take inventory, not of what I had lost, but of what I still carried. I had thought for too long that age had taken these things from me, but age had only made them quiet. And now with the door open again, they were beginning to speak. The weeks that followed felt as though the world had begun to tilt, slowly at first, through the subtle intensity of small choices and half-formed hopes, until suddenly the ground beneath me was unsteady, alive with tension. After that first open mic, something had shifted inside me, something older and sharper, something that demanded more than the quiet pleasure of being remembered in a room full of strangers. And so I began, half paused and half certain, to lean into it. It started with the oral history organizers. Maribel returned, recorder in hand, but this time she had a team, a videographer, a sound technician, and a shadow of counsel from a university liaison who asked polite clinical questions about my recollections of funding cuts, audience, demographics, the decline of repertory companies. I answered, my voice steadying in real time, drawing on memories of the deep-footed thrum of rehearsal rooms, the late-night bus rides after performances, the backstage jokes that scattered like dust in the spotlight. There was curiosity in their eyes, not pity, not nostalgia, but genuine interest in what I had lived through, and that interest felt like a transformation I had been starving for. They told me I would be featured in an upcoming documentary and a small exhibit, and I nodded as if I believed it, though a part of me thought I was being polite again, waiting for the moment when the facade would drop. But it didn't. They followed through. Still, as the outside world began to lean toward me, the inside world, my daughter, my granddaughter, my family, grew colder. A call from Eloise went unanswered for 2 days. When I called her back, it always felt casual, as though they were obliged to respond, but would never fully engage. When I arrived for a reading at the university archive in a dress that still fit and a scarf that moved like water at my throat, Lena looked at me but didn't see me. "Whatever you do," she said quietly as I hugged her goodbye, "just don't overdo it." I didn't ask what that meant. I only squeezed her arm. The words hung in the car mirror afterward. A knot in my chest, I loosened by breathing slowly, thinking that overdoing was choosing myself. They brought me to a panel event next, invited to sit among historians and former actors and community organizers to talk about living archives. I wore the same blouse I'd worn to the theater that first night, navy velvet collar like a different name stitched to my chest, and when I walked to the podium, I thought of the last row and how the spotlight found me before anyone remembered who I was. Up there, looking out at those faces, I didn't feel old. I felt current. I felt like a lens, focusing meaning where none had lingered. But it was after the event, when no one came to talk to me except a grudging journalism student who wanted a quote for their paper, that the second fracture snapped. In the lobby, a reporter said into the mic, "Tell us your message to the younger generation." And I said, before thinking, "Don't let them cast you in the back of your own life." The cameras clicked off. No one stood beside me. I sat alone on a folding chair, hands in my lap, feeling as though I'd done more than speak, like I'd torn open something real, and now everyone was stepping away as though it might crumble. Then a hand slid onto my shoulder, Maribel, soft, warm. In that moment, I realized the world couldn't step away. I had to keep showing up. At home, I did. I returned to that black box venue, week after week. I registered for the oral history exhibition. They wanted headshots, a bio, quotes. I stared at the blank form fields, trying to map who I was onto those lines, and finally wrote Clara Fontaine actor and devotee of forgotten stages, who remembers that stories salvage us even when the audiences vanish. It felt breathless to write those words about myself, but I did. Then came an email I wasn't expecting. A local theater director, one of those ambitious 20-somethings with a buzz she couldn't hide, had seen me at the panel and invited me to join a community workshop to help develop a performance on aging and invisibility. "Your experience brings authenticity," she wrote. I read the line twice. Authenticity. I had not thought of that word as something I could embody. I accepted and then reconsidered. I don't know if I wrote back with trembling fingers or with steady hope, but I said yes. The workshop met in a church basement that smelled of mildew and hope. Young actors drifted in carrying scripts printed on fluorescent paper. They asked me my experience, my memory, what I would change or reclaim. The young director, Jessa, stood and said, "We want to capture that moment when someone realizes they've been minimized and what it takes to speak again." She looked at me. I thought of that seat in the back, the joke in my daughter's kitchen, the soft erasure of years, and I spoke, not as a teacher, but as someone who'd lived inside the feeling, who had finally found the vocabulary for reclaiming it. The group listened. The scene grew around me, shaped not by dramatic scenes, but by the gravity of truth. They asked for more, scenes, fragments, memories. I gave them a script, my script, drafted in the margins of a notebook, that line I'd whispered on the platform. "You can only vanish if someone's still looking for you." They turned it in circles, echoing it, offering silences in between words. When they finally read it in performance, the room leaned in as though they were hearing me. I watched from the back row, no apology whispered in my ear, no apology offered, just a quiet standing among them. I still hear the warnings. Don't overdo it. Let it go. Move on. They flow around me like wind, but they no longer make me sway. I have begun to feel visible in ways I never thought possible. My name is back in programs, on web pages, in the hushed curiosity of students and strangers and memory keepers. I feel present, not just tolerated, not just fondly remembered, but alive. The second escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't stark. It was the build, the pivot, the feeling of time pushing me forward by inches until I realized I couldn't stand still anymore. And though the wound of being pushed there still blooms in those quieter moments, phone unanswered, glance redirected, there is now something deeper anchoring me. The memory of my own name, spoken in the light, the authority of voice honored again, realized, and that is enough to keep me writing the next chapter. It happened quietly, without ceremony or announcement. Just a message in my inbox with a subject line so unassuming I nearly deleted it. Space available for one woman slot, fall program. I clicked it open, expecting a list of auditions or another community event flyer, but instead I found a message from Jessa, the director from the workshop, asking if I'd be interested in developing something of my own for the fall fringe season. "We're holding a slot," she wrote. "If you're willing, it's yours." I sat there for several minutes, reading and rereading those words. I don't know what I expected would come of those long evenings in the church basement, the stories I'd handed over like pages torn from a diary, but I hadn't expected this. A slot, a stage, my name again as author, performer, center. The idea should have frightened me. It had been decades since I'd memorized more than a grocery list, and my body no longer moved the way it used to. My voice cracked sometimes without warning. But what I felt instead was a trembling certainty. I didn't hesitate. I typed, "Yes, I'll do it." Then I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, hands folded over my stomach, trying to steady the thrum in my ribs. It was coming, I thought. The reckoning, the return. But it wouldn't look like it once did. There would be no chorus, no lavish set, no director feeding me notes from behind a clipboard. This time, it would be only me, my words, my truth, and no one to interpret it but the audience sitting in the dark. I began with silence, not on stage, not yet, but on paper. I opened a blank document and stared at it for nearly 2 days, refusing to type a single word until the voice inside me was ready to speak without apology. Eventually it did, not with brilliance or clarity at first, but with insistence. The opening line came as a whisper. They left me in the last row, but the spotlight remembered. And from that single sentence, everything else began to form. I called it Last Row, a piece not about theater, not really, but about the slow death of being unseen and the strange, holy violence it takes to step back into view. I wrote it in fragments, the way memory moves, and laced the scenes with images I had carried in my chest for years. The cracked mirror in the dressing room, the creak of floorboards before the first line, the hum of silence when applause dies, and the house lights don't rise right away. Rehearsals happened in my apartment. I printed the script and read it aloud each day, at first like an exercise, then like a ritual. My voice faltered, caught, shook itself free. I practiced with a flashlight propped on a bookshelf, imagining the beam as a spotlight. My living room transformed, briefly, into something sacred again. I recorded myself, listened back, cringed, adjusted, tried again. I made space for the version of me that had once commanded a stage. She was rusty, yes, and older, certainly, but she was still here, waiting only for permission. I gave it. On opening night, I wore the navy blouse and the same scarf I had worn to the panel. I pinned my hair with care, put on lipstick that hadn't seen daylight in years. The theater was small, only 16 seats, a converted classroom above a co-op bookstore, but it was enough. The audience filtered in slowly, some from the community group, some from the workshop, 1 or 2 unfamiliar faces, and then, near the back, Lena entered. She looked around, uncertain, and sat alone in the last row. No Eloise, no polite smile, just her in a beige coat, clutching a program like she didn't know whether to read it or hide behind it. The lights dimmed, the room stilled. I walked on stage without music, without fanfare, barefoot, the way I used to in final tech runs. I stood in the center and let the silence stretch until I felt the audience lean in, then said, "At the theater, they gave me a ticket for the last row." The spotlight found me first a pause, then it wasn't meant to, but it did. Like light knows something we forget. I could feel the hush deepen, the audience caught in the hush between breath and meaning. I told them everything, not through confession, but through constructed truth. Scenes shaped by real moments, lines drawn from wounds I had stopped denying. I spoke of the phone that didn't ring, the birthday slideshows where I was missing, the dinners where I took photos instead of being in them. I told them what it felt like to disappear, not all at once, but slowly, through omission, until you become a convenient afterthought, a footnote in a life you helped build. I didn't cry. My voice held. My body held. I delivered the final line. You only vanish if you agree to go quietly, and the room stayed still for one long breath, then another, and then came the sound I hadn't known I needed. Applause. Not thunderous, not wild, just honest, enough to fill my chest with something heavy and whole. After the show, people came to speak with me. They touched my hand, said thank you, asked nothing, and then Lena approached. She didn't speak right away. She just stood there, eyes damp, mouth soft. "I didn't know," she said. I didn't want to know. But now I do. I nodded. I didn't say, I warned you. I didn't say, you chose silence. I only said, I'm still here. And she said, I see that now. She didn't hug me. I didn't offer. We stood in that truth together for the first time in years. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the traffic hum below. The scarf still lay across the arm of the chair. My script rested on the table. I thought of the spotlight, not the one in the theater, but the one inside me that had refused to go dark. It had waited, patient, steady, and finally, it had been turned outward again. Now, the days pass in a rhythm I recognize, not for its speed or excitement, but for its intention. There's a steadiness to how I move through the hours, a kind of quiet certainty I didn't have before, not the arrogance of youth or the frantic hope of being seen, but something older, something earned. I wake early. I make tea in the heavy blue mug I once brought to rehearsals. I water the plant that still leans toward the morning light. The apartment is still modest, still quiet, but it no longer feels like a waiting room for something I've missed. It feels like mine. On the wall above the writing desk, I've pinned the flyer from the show, the one with my name in thick, imperfect font, and next to it, the photograph someone took of me just after the final bow, standing still, hands loose, eyes forward, the light, catching the silver in my hair like an unspoken answer. I look at that image sometimes and remember the moment not as a peak or victory, but as an alignment, as if the years had finally come to agreement inside my body, as if the girl who once whispered lines to the mirror and the woman who had learned to live in silence had shaken hands at last. Lena calls now, not often, not dramatically, but when she does, her voice holds something different, less distance, more presence. She asks what I'm working on, not as a formality, but with real interest. Eloise sent me an email, short, a little clumsy, saying she had read about the show in a blog post and that she was sorry she missed it. I replied with a line I meant sincerely. The door is open. I didn't write more. I didn't need to. Some relationships don't resolve with fanfare. Some heal only in the space you stop forcing. I don't know if we'll become close again or if they will ever fully understand the way their absence shaped me. But I no longer need that. Not the apology, not the clarity. I needed the story to be told. I needed to stop holding it in my mouth like a stone. Sometimes I walk past the old theater, or what's left of it, the shell of a building now used for bridal expos and weekend markets, and I don't feel bitterness. I feel gratitude. That space, that stage, those wooden beams that once echoed my voice, they made me, but they didn't finish me. I thought, for a long time, that everything worth saying had already been said, that I had peaked in a past no one remembered. But the truth is, I was not done. I had only been paused, and it took being pushed to the edges of rooms, of conversations, of memory, for me to choose to return to the center. There's a new group forming at the Black Box Theater. They've asked me to mentor, to sit in, to guide, not because I'm a relic, but because I still know how to listen between the lines. And I've started writing more, not plays exactly, but fragments, monologues, letters to my younger self, words I wish someone had spoken aloud when I first began to vanish. Maybe I'll perform again. Maybe I won't. That's not the point anymore. The point is I am no longer shrinking. I no longer wait for someone else to cast me in my own life. I speak, I write, I show up. To the woman reading this who feels like she's been placed in the last row, out of the way, out of focus, out of frame, I want to say this: the light hasn't forgotten you. Even if they've stopped asking, Even if the calls don't come, even if the mirror starts to reflect only fatigue and faint lines, the light remembers. You are not finished. You are not ornamental. You are not only your usefulness. There is a stage that still fits you, even if you have to build it plank by plank from memory and willpower. Speak anyway. Stand anyway. Take up space, even if your voice trembles. Especially then, because once the spotlight touches you again, you will remember what it feels like to be seen, not as someone who used to matter, but as someone who still does.